friends, and welcome back to the Rewind podcast of Forward Church. Join us each week as we take a look back on Sunday's message and dig a little deeper into the conversations with those who are teaching across our sites at Forward. We want to invite you to be part of the conversation too. So if something we're talking about on Sunday morning sparks a question in you, head to our website, forwardchurch.ca/ask us, and submit your questions there. And we're going to do our best to engage with those questions in this space. With that said, let's jump in and get started.
It is a special episode of the Rewind podcast today because we have all three of our teaching pastors here with us today. Say hi all at the same time, gentlemen.
Hi.
Well, that was great. Good job, guys. Did that make you uncomfortable? Because it's going to get more uncomfortable.
Oh, boy.
It's only a good podcast if we get uncomfortable a little bit. Welcome. This is a little intimidating, I have to say, although I am on this side, and I feel like a little backwards. So I'm like, I don't know where to look at the listeners. Gabe, is it there? Is it there? It's definitely there.
That's your camera right,
All right.
there, Blair.
Welcome to the Forward Rewind podcast.
I'm glad you said that because I'm rarely on this side of the table, so I'm very confused right now.
I said they decided to keep the estrogen
you're
over
up
here.
there.
Oh, okay.
Daryl.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's me. Kirk's
Perfect.
over here, and Blair's there.
I feel
This
like
is what happens when you make Baptists sit in different seats.
Yeah, you're right.
my
Give me my spot back, Derek.
Pointing to the
Goodness
cameras makes
sakes.
great radio. So
I feel like with the 4 screens, we need to have like some sitcom music, and we all need to like turn our heads and like with the name, but we won't do that. Welcome to the third week of our series. Before we jump into the good stuff, I want to talk about our amazing worship night on Sunday night. All 3 of you were there. Well done. I know football was on, so like I wasn't sure who was going to be there. Out of Kirk and Derek.
Blair made Kirk made the greatest sacrifice. Blair.
He did. I know. I said something to Derek, and he was like, "It's not my team, or whatever."
That is what I said.
And you have had a very busy weekend too, Kirk.
Yeah, we did.
So I just high five you, man,
But
across
it was,
the table.
It was okay. It was a great night.
Yeah, it was so
It was
good.
better being at the prayer and worship night than it was sitting at home watching the first half of the football game.
I
It's
agree.
definitely better than watching the second half.
Definitely better than watching the second half.
Those are one
Too
of the
soon, Derek. Too soon.
Sorry.
it's tender.
I tried to sit to the wide right of Kirk.
Way too soon, man.
Oh man, I think Kirk's gonna start crying in the first few minutes of our podcast.
It's possible.
Oh man, usually it takes a lot more than that. We have had him almost leave though once, so that was a good episode.
well, our home is not really big into football, but before coming out to that worship night, Parker and I did sit down and watch some Dude Perfect.
Oh, that's
So
right.
I'm just gonna say that if real football included attaching rockets to the football while they throw it,
brilliant.
I would be down. Like that's pretty entertaining.
Totally.
But, yeah,
I could totally see Parker loving that.
Oh
Like,
yes,
he's probably
sport adjacent that we call that.
Sport adjacent. That's about right.
Oh, I loved that. No, it was a great night of prayer and community, which is going to be a key theme here today in our podcast. And the kiddos got to dance around, and
That was awesome.
that was fun.
I loved that.
I had a front row seat for that. That was amazing.
Yeah,
That was so great.
It was some twirling and just all the things. My heart was twirling with them, although I'm kind of at the age now where I can't twirl because just nausea and old age, but something might pop. Anyways, okay. I did want to ask a question because we have all 3 of you, and we never usually have all 3 of you, but we don't want to take up too much time because we've got great questions to touch on. So, we're talking about relationships. This is week 3, renewing relationships, and I thought this is a great question to ask. Out of anyone in the entire world, it has to be a real person, dead or alive. Who would you want to have a relationship with, like a friendship with? Dead or alive, real person, but you only have 15 seconds to say who and why.
Wow.
And I know that you only have a sec to think about it, so I can start. I would want to be buds with Martin Short because I just think he would be so much fun to hang out with. And he's kind of like that, like slapstick funny, but also really witty. And I just feel like he'd keep me on my toes and we'd be homies. 15 seconds. Who else has one?
Jesus.
I was
gonna say. Man.
You can't say
Stole my.
Jesus.
Okay, a non-
Unlimited bread and wine.
Forget that. I thought you were going to say like healing or something. Bread and wine.
Okay, like non-Bible character.
Okay.
Non-Bible
I
character.
mean, you could say Bible character. Well, all right, fine. Non-Bible
non-Bible
character.
character.
Because all the pastors are going to pick
Yeah.
Bible characters.
So Daryl's going to say Martin Luther or something like that.
You can pick them. Whatever. Do you
fine.
have
You
one,
can pick
Kirk?
Yeah, no, I don't know. I can narrow it down to one
No.
in that short time.
Pick a
frame.
good one.
For me, I would love to hang out with some of the great inventors of
Oh, yeah, that's
the
your-
history of the world. I just people who are entrepreneurial and are inventors, just to sit and try and glean a little bit of their mind. I would just love to do stuff like that. So there's a lot of things I don't like and disagree with Elon Musk on, but I would love to just sit down, hang out, and just get a little glimpse into what makes that guy tick.
I love that.
Yeah.
That was your 15 seconds, though.
Yeah.
Can't say anything else now. Derek?
Oh man, I've been reading a lot and about Napoleon lately.
Interesting.
He's just a fascinating dude, and the impact that he has had on history is incredible. Probably like either him or Alexander the Great. I find individuals that like just shape the course of human events, with the sheer force of their personality.
Yeah.
Pretty interesting. I'd be really interested to sit
That's
down
your
with them.
jam. I feel like I could have guessed something with that history thing because that's your jam for sure. Okay, that was 15 seconds. Daryl.
Awesome, great. Well, you guys went way more serious than I was. I was gonna.
I said Martin Short,
No,
Daryl.
I was gonna say Tom Cruise. That guy just seems crazy. So
That's a good
answer.
You gotta jump on a couch with them.
Yeah.
No, like he does. Like his thought process on like the films that he does. I
Yeah.
find those conversations fascinating. So like here's the thing that like I hate. Like I'll watch an interview with someone who's like in a film. They're like, oh, I forgot I was even in that film. I don't even remember. Then you'll hear someone like Tom Cruise, like he like meticulously works on every shot, or like Jack Black, who like deeply cares about the films that, even though he does like dumb films, like he deeply cares about the work that he does. And I find those conversations really fascinating of why put so much effort into that.
Interesting.
there
You
you
got
go.
20 seconds. Just
sorry.
so you know. Anyway,
We got
Par for the
Daryl.
course.
I thought, yeah.
Just got Daryl.
Just got Daryl.
I felt like mine needed more justification.
Fine. Well done. I feel like this could be a future podcast topic.
Favorite
because-
Martin Short movie though?
I don't have a favorite Martin Short movie, but I do love his stand up. And anyway, he's awesome. And my other list was mostly comedians. But I appreciate the authenticity of yours. Let's get to the good stuff. We want to hear the overview of your messages and the main takeaways, which I realize might be challenging with 3 people. So I'm only going to give you 30 seconds. And Derek told me I have to take the reins, so I
gotta
might
take the reins.
interrupt you. Why don't we start with Derek?
Yep. I talked about what it means to be a follower of Jesus growing in love, and we looked at things, as we've been talking about, to put off and put on. So putting off isolation, putting on community, putting off pretending, putting on authenticity, putting off speech that hurts, putting on speech that helps, and putting off retaliation, putting off reconciliation.
That's right. And you were talking on our
Was
online.
speaking to those who are joining us online on Sunday.
That's right. And we had a brief energy blip.
a little power outage.
So if you want to see Derek's deer eyes and headlights.
I was frozen on the screen, and I didn't know what was going on anywhere else in the internets.
Yeah, in the interweb.
Yeah.
Oh, I love that. No, it was great. It all came back together. But Kirk, you were part of that blip. Did you even notice?
Oh yeah.
Oh, you did notice.
Oh yeah. It was like the lights
Yeah.
went out noticeably,
Yeah.
came back on. There was loud popping sounds
Okay.
everywhere in the auditorium.
Were you like, is it the rapture, or are we just having a...
No, I just thought maybe God was trying to speak to us in the moment, and it was
stop you from
or
speaking.
stopped me from speaking. Yeah, it was.
well,
There was a few people who might have had a heart attack.
Oh,
at that
no.
point. It was very noticeable during the
Oh,
service.
dear.
Yeah.
Okay, well, give us your overview of your message.
Yeah, same ideas where Derek was at, in the sense of talking about what it means to love others well, and just rooted on the second half of the Great Commandment and second part of our mission statement as a church. So focused on what does it mean to love others well, and talked about being willing to pursue relationship with people, and talked about the kind of impact we can have in people's lives. And that to love others well means you have to change the way you handle conflict. and to be the person whose words build up rather than tear down, and to love others well, replacing a judgmental spirit and bitterness with forgiveness and empathy. And then I close with the idea that how well you love people is directly connected to how well you love God.
Yeah, you had kind of a doozy end there. You said, I wrote it down because it was intense. It said, the more you build your life on how much God has shown his love to you, the more that you will realize that kindness, compassion, and forgiveness is the only way forward.
Yep.
If you love God most, you will love others best.
Yeah.
Those are like kind of mic drop statements. So I wrote them down, which we are going to peel apart during our podcast. But Daryl, we need to get your overview as well.
Yeah, you bet. So, yeah, on Sunday, really focus on this idea that the problem of our relationships is that we are sinners and we end up hurting those around us. And so really that's why we need our relationships to be renewed, and really focus on these two ideas that we need to put off being self-centered and put on reflecting Christ, and spent most of the time just reflecting on what does that actually look like in our lives to reflect Christ. And that's in our words, our attitudes, and our actions.
Well done. I can't skip this question. I realize we can't probably have each of you answer it, but is there anything out of the three of you that stood out to you most in your study or prep this week? Or if there was anything you wished you could have spent more time on in your message? Again, we don't have to go through, but if there was, just jump in.
Yeah, for me, it actually came when I was studying the Great Commandment piece near the beginning of the message, and just the idea where Jesus says, love your neighbor as yourself. And I was thinking a lot about the reality that we live in a culture of people who go, well, I don't love myself, so therefore, what does that mean? How does that play out in my relationships? And I wanted to spend more time diving into that aspect of things. I just didn't have the space to do it, but I think it is a very important thought to work through for people today, because I actually think we love ourselves way more than we think we love ourselves.
Right. Yeah.
And it's just a language issue of how we describe what we think about ourselves.
Yeah, you did kind of touch on it. Do you think maybe it'll come up again
Yep.
as we talk here? Anybody else? I don't want to take it away because I love this question.
I would delve more into the idea of being the importance of being transparent in community. I didn't have all the things I wish I could have unpacked a little bit more, but especially that area of making yourself known and vulnerable, the risk that is, but also the necessity that it is in order for you to really grow.
Yeah, not an easy thing to do, but the reward of doing it is huge.
Yeah, and it's also almost guaranteed to at times be very painful to you when you enter into that, but it's really the only way forward.
Right. We got three. Daryl, I don't want to take away from you. Was there anything you want to touch on?
Yeah, I was just going to say that in a message like this, we're in a section where it's a list, and I always find those passages a little hard to preach through because you can tear that apart and just kind of preach a message on each and every aspect that Paul's preaching or writing about here. So the one that I found I could have spent a lot more time on and really found a lot of necessity to spend time on is addressing anger. And so we just had our discipleship group meeting last night, and we talked a lot about that part of the passage of it says to be angry and do not sin. And what exactly does that look like? And and I love doing this with my group. I love everyone was agreeing with one aspect. And I said, well, what about this scenario? And then now everyone was agreeing with that. I'm like, all right, so this is complicated, right? And then we just spent a lot more time just delving more and more into what it means as Christians, as followers of Christ. How can we be angry? And so I feel like I could have spent a lot more time on that.
I feel like that's very you, Daryl. You're like, no, you don't know. I don't know if playing the devil's advocate describes you necessarily, but like you'll always kind of twist it back to, and you'll be like, wait a second, I thought we landed here, and then you'll be like, but what about this? And then your mind is blown.
It's trying to challenge assumptions.
I love that. You're a challenger. If you don't challenge us, we'll just, laziness comes in, right?
Really good discussion last night. This passage,
good.
there's so much in here. we got through about 3 questions out of 10. So
Oh boy, well, we better get started then, because we did have our listeners come to the rescue and text in some questions. We got 3 questions texted in. Thank you to the listeners. Please don't stop doing that. Please keep doing it. And hey, if you're listening live, we have a live chat. Gabe does not have a mic today, but he'll just throw something at me or something and say, hey, you got a question, and we will read it. So chime in. Why don't we start with our first one here? Is there one? Oh, I thought you said something. I got really excited. Larry just prayed for the podcast. Thanks, Larry. Pray for us as we podcast. I love this. Okay, let's ask our first texted in question. Regarding the loneliness... Okay, we're off to a great start. Regarding the loneliness epidemic, how do we teach young kids not to get caught up in the idea that being connected on social media is not the same as real relationships, i.e. your list of Facebook friends or Instagram followers is a fruitless goal to chase?
So I talked about the loneliness epidemic in near the beginning of my message, and just talking about the importance of putting yourself in places where you can be pursuing relationship with people. And even the reality that you can feel lonely even when you're around people. And so the importance of all of us doing intentional things to love others so that we can battle the loneliness epidemic that we're living in right now. I think there's a couple things. First of all, to give kids the benefit of the doubt, I would say this. Sometimes if you have not grown up living in a generation who communicates digitally, you do not fully understand how kids actually are building some form of community digitally.
Okay.
And so it is important. Don't make assumptions that your kids are not building community.
Okay.
That is, like, as a parent, that's one of the dangerous things that you have to understand that they probably are building community. The question is, what kind of community are they building?
Right. There's good and bad.
Right. Yeah. And there's different layers. In the same way that when you're in person, there's good and bad. And when you're in person, there are also different layers of community that happens, right? To Derek's point about vulnerability, there's different layers of vulnerability that happen when you're in person. And for a lot of kids, there's different layers of vulnerability that happen digitally, virtually, with their friends. So as a parent, don't make the assumption that no community is happening when they are online. It's probably happening to a greater extent than you think it is. So what you want to do is you want to explore and try to understand, what is the community that you're experiencing? Where is it taking you? What are the conversations like? The same way that you would if they were going to a party with their friends. Like, it's the same kind of conversation. It's in a different space and place. The other thing is, you want to really encourage kids that the virtual should never be the thing that just always replaces the in-person and the flesh-on-flesh kind of connection, the face-to-face connection. So just try to encourage the kids that it's okay to be in that space, but don't solely live in that space.
Oh, that's great advice.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with Kirk. I think it's really important for those of us who are probably older millennials and up, who in our minds have clear delineations and distinctions between real world and online world, to understand that if you have grown up in a reality where online has always existed, online world is real world. Yeah. And real world is, like, those things are not separate categories. We can debate whether they should be, but they're not. So we have to deal with this reality.
Right.
I think about the fact that if you're going to teach somebody how to kind of know what a counterfeit is, you want to expose them to the real thing.
Yeah.
Right.
There's nothing wrong with online community, and online community can play a very helpful role in somebody's life. But I think if you've experienced real community in the flesh in person, you realize there's something that doesn't take place online that you do need in proximity, in incarnation, right? With the flesh on with people. And sometimes you just have to be able to put people in places and spaces where they realize, okay, that's something, and it's not nothing, but I need this other thing.
Yep.
Yeah, like not an exclusive thing, like you were sort of saying. And I mean, Daryl, you touched a bit on social media and I think it was you, and talking about like the highlight, how it can filter, and we get like a highlight of people's lives, but that's not necessarily the relationship that we're talking about. That's just things we're seeing.
Yeah, I mean, like that's the danger of social media, is that you can just kind of present the highlights of your life
Sure.
and never really look at the real issues that are going on. And so I think like there is a bit of a danger in using technology that way with friends, or however you're making connections, is there is that way which we can present not a real authentic version of ourselves. When you're hanging out in person, it's just a little harder to maybe hide those things a little bit more. But
I guess you could still do it though.
I was going to say, I've seen lots of people hide lots of stuff in person.
Well, I mean,
but it's easier online, I think.
I've grown up in church a long time and seen a lot of people put on a brave face and pretend to be a lot of things while their life was falling apart.
Here's a really, like, this happened in my home recently. So our son, Sam, plays a lot of online gaming.
okay.
Yep.
And so he's got his headphones on. He's talking to people all the time online, and it's like they're in the same room with each other, but they're not in the same room as each other, and they're playing video games together, just like a bunch of guys who are friends would do.
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the other night he's like, I'm going out. I'm like, well, where are you going? Yeah, I'm going over to my friend's house, which is like across the street from us, who is one of his friends he does gaming with all the time.
Okay.
He's like, I'm going over to his house tonight and we're going to just hang out and play games. So even this reality of I can live in this virtual space, but every once in a while, it's really good for me to just go and hang out together physically in the same space.
Yeah.
And just be together as friends. And I thought, good for you. Good for you guys for taking that step where it would have just been so much easier to just continue to sit by yourselves in the basement and do gaming, that you took that step to say, let's get together in the same space and hang out.
But I would agree that like so much of this, like the principles come into play, whether it's online or in person, of how to develop a strong relationship. I remember reading something written by John Acuff. He's an author, and he talks a fair amount about parenting. And he was saying how his girls, they were now in their teen years, and they have a very strict cell phone use policy in their home. He actually looks up the policy of like what the social media website says. So Instagram's like, you have to be 15 or whatever to use this. And he'll just straight up say to his girls, he's like, well, the policy on the site says you can't use this yet, even if you want to. And so they're like, no cell phones. And then eventually got to the point where he realized the girls' like discipleship group leaders were texting everyone in their discipleship group and praying for them and being part of this conversation. But because they were being a bunch of Luddites and not using technology, they were completely out of this conversation. And then him and his wife had to say, okay, I think we have to bite the bullet and like let them use this because they're out of the loop. And they had to kind of figure this out as parents of what does that mean to cultivate relationships. And you can't just assume in our modern world that you can just cut that out entirely. But it's still with this pursuit of like really good, deep, rich relationships. And I think like that works whether it's in person or online, that the goal ends up being the same.
We have a discipleship group in our church, that at least one, that meets exclusively online.
Yeah.
Yep.
Except for 3 or 4 times in the year, they get together and have meals together in person.
Wow.
Yep.
And they are a very tight-knit group.
Yeah.
They've built great relationships and very effective in the work that they're doing together. So don't be afraid of the online space as a space to build a relationship.
Yeah, and I think what you kind of touched on too, like you sort of paralleled the online and tech versus in person. And I think you highlighted the benefits of just relationships, regardless of it's online or in person. But I think, and you also kind of started to talk about the same idea of like parenting, asking questions and like keeping your eye on their friends. Like you still have to do the same because there are still bad communities.
It's the same foundational principles, whether it's in person or online.
Yeah, the things that we talked about putting off and putting on, whether that's in person or online, these are the things.
Yeah. It almost like it just looks differently.
Yeah.
Like it just looks different, how you're going to filter that and how you're going to follow up on that. No, I think that's great. Anything to add, or should we go to the next question? Maybe we might end up bringing this back up again. I have a feeling. But the next question is, is telling people truth about an ungodly behavior considered unloving?
It is if you're unloving in the way that you say it.
Ooh, Oh, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
The act of telling somebody that they are in an ungodly, doing something that's ungodly, can be intensely loving, because there's nothing more loving that you can do than to try and get somebody away from doing something that is self-destructive to them, right? And sin is destructive to our souls, to ourself, to our relationship with God and with others. But what is the posture in which you confront somebody, and what is the driving motivation behind why you're calling somebody out, right? Those things matter deeply, and if your real reason is you're calling somebody out because it makes you feel good and puts you on a higher level, problem. If you're calling out an ungodly behavior with a level of harshness that the person is not going to in any way receive this. Now, here's what you need to know. No matter how kindly, no matter what your motivation is between when you go to call somebody out about their sin, there's a good chance in which they are not going to receive it as love from you. But you have to know that it is coming out of a heart of love, and you've made every effort to communicate in a way that is loving to them.
And I think that principle applies almost for everything in this passage. In this world of being a person who loves others well, and these descriptions in here giving us some handles to run on in terms of how we love others well. One of the things that was a limitation to this message is you can't explain the fullness of relationships, and it always requires the other person responding in a certain way.
Right.
The only thing that's in your control is whether or not you're loving the other person well.
Right. Yeah.
And so I would agree wholeheartedly with what Derek has said in answering that question.
Can I give you one piece of practical advice if you're a person who is going to enter into this situation? Once you have finished saying what you're going to say, ask the question, what have you heard me say?
Yeah.
Oh, that's a good piece.
That opens up the opportunity for a feedback loop where they can tell you whether what you have said and meant to say is actually what they've received.
That came up in the Alpha Marriage course. Actually, it comes up where
that's just good communication.
It is. It gets good communication.
That's opening up a communication loop and dialogue, right?
Yeah. Anything to add on top of that, Daryl?
No, that's great.
That's great.
If you find yourself having to have those kinds of conversations on a regular basis, like let's say you're a supervisor at a workplace or things like that. There are a couple books out there that are really good in terms of helping you with some communication skills on these kinds of conversations. So we just finished actually working with some of our staff through a book called Difficult Conversations, and just giving you some good handles to have that kind of communication with people.
I like the little piece of just remembering that, like, if you've said what you felt you needed to say, said it in a grace-filled way and from a loving place, you can rest in that and knowing that, and then just praying for them, I guess, that they would absorb it, right? Because your sort of task is done, and the rest is kind of up to them because we can't change them, but the Lord can. So, okay, we got a third one texted in this morning. It's a mouthful, so here we go. Good thing I talk fast. You talked about relationships in terms of what we put into them as opposed to what we get out. And I think this is a very important part of being in a love relationship. Can you, it says, expound just a little bit on the difference between truly loving someone versus doing loving things? I think we can rely on doing loving things in order to try to satisfy the love part. Would this be very similar to doing things for the Lord instead of cultivating a deep relationship with Him? That's a good question. Do you want me to kind of touch on the actual question part?
I think the real question there seems to be, is it possible that you're just doing loving things without...
To check the love box or
right,
to just satisfy the love.
In order to say that I've loved somebody.
Right. Yeah, because they said a truly love the difference between truly loving someone versus doing loving things.
This is a question that would be a lot easier, to be really honest, if there were if I had an example to work off of.
Oh, okay.
So I'm just trying to think through right now what that could look like in real life. So that's why I'm pausing.
Me too. I think the one thing I want to say on this is a great relationship requires giving and receiving. That's part of what makes a relationship great, right? So God gives us his love, but what helps the relationship to become something is we receive that love that he's given to us. And what Jesus calls us to is to love God in return in terms of our, as we talked about last week, we love God by living in obedience to him. And that is how we show our love for God. So, I think that I don't want someone to think, oh, I'm doing things for someone, therefore I'm not pursuing relationship with them, or I'm not loving them. Because actually, if you are serving someone and you are doing things for the person, you are pursuing a relationship with that person. That's, in marriage relationships, we've talked a lot about things like love languages. When you understand the love language of your spouse, if you live out the love language of your spouse, you are pursuing relationship with that person. It's not just about, sitting down and spending quality time together, because if frankly the person wants you just to get them gifts or help clean the house, sitting down and spending quality time is not actually building the relationship.
Right.
You're just frustrating the other person because they see the things that need to be cleaned up around the house.
Right.
So understanding what is it that makes the other person tick, so that you can serve the other person in a meaningful way to invest in their life. And they can do the same thing for you. That is how you're going to build that relationship.
So, so much of this, it seems like it comes down to both an intent on our part and also how we view the other person. Yeah, do you actually view the other person as valuable as a son or daughter of God, or like all these things? Like, I think it's how we view, because there are certain relationship books that I guess I wouldn't recommend, where they kind of approach the relationship. It's, if you're not getting the affection that you want in your marriage, let's just put it that way, and then just go and like make sure that you're like vacuuming and like doing certain things, and then your spouse will respond the way you want. And it's like, that's kind of manipulative. Like, that's not actually viewing them as a real person. You're, at the end of the day, you're just trying to get what you want to get out of the relationship. And that's a trap that I think we can fall into when we read a passage like this and think, and I shared a lot of this on Sunday, kind of trying to white knuckle our way through. Just like, I'm just going to work really hard at being just a really good person, and then other people will receive love from me, and that'll be great. But that's not the intention of the passage. It's saying, you put on your new identity in Christ, and now you're being transformed, and it will lead into these actions.
Right.
And so Scripture does call us to this. Is, I think, what trips us up. It calls us into obedience into these actions, but not just merely obedience into these actions. And so we're not just merely showing love. You actually have to love the other person. And so much of that has to be relying on Christ to empower us to be able to have that perspective that's so essential to have.
Right. That's like what Kirk said at the end. If you love God most, you'll love others best.
Yeah, because God ends up shaping your love for others, right? Like when you love God and you understand God's love for you, and you rest in that love for you that God's shown to you, he actually transforms your heart to give you the ability to love others well. And that's like, that for anything, that is the danger for Christians, is we kind of create our checklist of things. I got to change this. I got to change this. And it becomes a to-do list as opposed to being changed in our hearts through the grace of God.
Right. Yeah.
I will say that I think oftentimes, because of our culture, we have an assumption that it only counts as love if the acts of love flow out of feelings of love. And sometimes it's acts of love that develop feelings of love.
Yeah.
Right? Sure. Sometimes we have to have an act of the will, and we have to be careful not to say, well, that doesn't count because, like, I don't think you really meant it. I don't think you really felt like, if a person is sacrificed because they're trying, it counts.
Yeah.
So I, that would be my one caution in this, that, like, don't assume about the motivations of the person unless you know the motivations of the person.
Sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and that kind of like when you were talking about it, like within marriages, Daryl, and you were sort of talking about like it sounded like maybe what you're talking about was like you can give to with the intention to get. Right, like when you're talking about like the marriages and the love languages, like you can speak the love language because you have an intention of actually getting something for yourself, which is not
really loving the other person.
No.
It's a very selfish motivation.
You can figure out how to love the other person, is what Derek's saying.
Yeah.
Like I heard this great example before of, it's like Valentine's Day is coming up and you want to show, love to your spouse. So you end up Googling, romantic, dates and stuff. And someone might get upset, like, oh, it should just come out of, out of your heart. And it's like, yeah, I mean, the intention's out of the heart, but also like, Google's really helpful to figure out ideas of like, where's the best place in the city to go out on a date? So there's, you can use those tools, you can plan, but it can't just be merely that you plan and use those tools.
And this is where, I've done in a lot of marriage counseling, especially with guys, where guys are sitting there going, but I am doing all the things she wants me to do, and she's not reciprocating.
Yeah.
And I want to give up because she's not reciprocating.
Yeah.
Right?
That's why I call loaded love language.
So one of the things, like this is where what I was talking about at the end of the message really comes into play. Like I always say to guys, the bottom line is this is about your love for God more than it is about you trying to change your wife.
Yeah.
You keep loving her, not because you're trying to change something in her. You keep loving her because you love God and God has asked you to love her.
Mm-hmm. I love that.
And with no expectations of is she going to measure up to whatever your fantasy dreams are of what you're looking for. You keep loving her just because God has told you to love her.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I love that.
Yeah. I ended my message talking about the concept of the love bank.
Yeah.
And this is the reality, right? That when we don't have Jesus' love flowing into us, then you always will end up in any relationship at some point with somebody getting to the point where the count has been overdrawn.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
The reality is that with Christ, knowing his unconditional love for us, we always have the resources to pay out in love, whether we've received back and got deposits from the other person or not.
That's
I love that. A bottomless account. I love that.
That's right.
It's a good analogy for those of us who need analogies to understand stuff. Should we carry on? Anybody else want to throw anything else into the table there? All right. You can have your phone back, Derek. I'll give it to you later. No, I only read a couple texts.
Did you see
Nothing interesting, I can guarantee you that.
They're probably all gifts anyway. All right. We've got 3 that we wanted to touch on still. And I was going to use your phone as a clock, Derek, so you might have to wave at me if I'm running out of time.
running out of time?
Am I running out of time? Let's jump in. Is it worth discussing boundaries when it comes to loving others? Example, burnout or harmful relationships, etc. Are there ever times to put off a relationship?
Yes. There
Okay.
are.
Next question.
So
No, I'm just kidding.
here's what I want to. Here's what I would say. You always need to put on forgiveness.
Okay.
No matter what happens to you, the harm that has been done to you. Our call as those who have been forgiven is to forgive. But forgiveness and reconciliation are not the same thing. And I think this is a really important distinction to make, because reconciliation requires repentance. It requires somebody actually making an effort to move. And even when there's reconciliation, it doesn't mean the relationship goes back to the way it was.
Right.
Our actions have consequences. They affect how relationships function, the trust that will be in a relationship moving forward. That's the reality. Sin breaks things. Jesus can restore things. He can make things new. But it doesn't go back to the way it was. Sometimes it can be much better. But if you are in a position where somebody is repeatedly walking in a position where they harm you, it is not loving to put yourself in that position to the other person or to yourself. To yourself, Jesus doesn't want you to be treated that way.
That's right.
For the other person, all you're doing is enabling them to continue walking in sin. And we've already talked about how self-destructive and harmful sin is. So it's not loving to allow somebody to continue to walk in sin.
that's the part of my message where I wish I was going to bring up freedom session. And I wish I had brought it up there, because I believe in freedom session, they talk a lot about what does forgiveness look like.
Yep.
Absolutely.
And I think for anyone who's in that position, that's really helpful to think through, what does forgiveness look like? And how do you, as you said, like, how do you forgive, and yet does that relationship need to be reconciled? How to walk through that.
I love that. And you brought it up, Kirk, that it's starting up again in the fall.
Yep.
If you want more info on that, text, I don't know,
Just
freedom.
go to the website.
Just go to the website.
Yep.
And however, if you are someone like the first thing that I think of when I think about that type of thing is like abuse, right?
Yep.
So maybe you're someone who needs some help there. You can just call the church office, or maybe text coach or counsel to 226-212-7117. Let us help you with that. Anything to add to that one before we move on?
Yeah, I think in the area of, are there times where you have to put off a relationship? I mean, this whole passage is talking about putting off our old selves. And so often there can be people in our lives that draw us back into our old selves and do not push us towards Christ. And so in verse 31, it speaks of bitterness. And I think like that is one where bitterness is difficult to cultivate in your heart in total isolation. Like bitterness is easy to receive from someone else. It's an attitude, it's a perspective that spreads very easily. And so there might be that we need to have certain boundaries in our lives to make sure that we're not allowing others to bring bitterness into our hearts and into our relationship. And so we have to just be clear in those boundaries of what is allowing us to continue to grow in our identity in Christ, and be aware of where are the dangers, where are the relationships that can pull us back into the old self.
I think that's a great example, Daryl. And I would say this: we kind of live in these two different cultures. So in a church culture, there tends to be this emphasis on just forgive people and move on and make everything the way that it was. In outside the church culture, there is very much this sense of create clear boundaries, and there's almost this default of we'll never forgive people or reconcile any relationship. We're just going to completely move on from everything. And so I think this is where having a few people who are godly people in your life really matters. People who can give you some godly counsel, because most of us, we don't put up the boundaries we should. And then when we shouldn't put up boundaries, when we actually should pursue relationship and reconciliation with someone, we've bought into the message of, no, I've just got my boundaries and I'm never going there.
Right.
And we actually should be pursuing reconciliation with someone. So having some godly counsel around us, a few people who can speak into the situation to help us think straight, becomes incredibly important in this kind of a situation, so that we are honoring God with our lives.
I love that. That's so good. I was going to say great question, but I thought of it, so I'm going to say it anyway. That was a great question.
Good job, Blair.
Thanks, girl. I love that. This is a good lead into the second question too, though. What are some of the biggest or most common stumbling blocks that can prevent us from pursuing relationships?
Fear.
Yeah.
Most of us have
like a social anxiety or a fear of like rejection?
I think all of us have a fear of rejection.
Yeah.
All of us have a fear that if people really knew, they might run away from us. Or if we open ourselves up and they do really get to know us and they run away from us, or they act in a way that's what does that say about me, right? This is why the gospel is so beautiful, because the reality of the gospel is God sees us at our very worst, and he runs toward us, not away from us, right? There's nothing hidden from him, and yet he runs towards us with love. And when Christian community is being Christian community, that's what it looks like, that we have the ability to open up and allow people in because they run towards us with love, but they don't let us stay where we are. But the reality is there's sin in the picture, right? And so this is the other thing. One is fear and the other is past hurt.
Yeah.
Because there are people who have done this. They're like, you're listening right now. You're like, I've opened myself up to people. I've been vulnerable in church and I have been hurt.
Yeah.
And that is also an inevitability when you have a whole room full of people who are still struggling with putting off the old self and putting on the new self. And we're all in process of that. And so you have to know that at times entering into community, as good as Christian community can be, there is the likelihood, almost the inevitability, that you will suffer hurt at some point.
That's huge to like. I think you're right. I think it's a massive stumbling block that can bring people not just in relationship with community within the church, but even outside the church. Right? It's just the real reality of sin in and around us. Right? Anything else to add to that, gentlemen?
Yeah, I think one thing I would add into that of what can be a stumbling block of relationships is actually creating the space for those relationships to actually happen.
That's good. Yeah.
We live in a very transient and fast-paced society. So that means that things can happen very quickly, and we tend not to stick around very quickly. We tend to stick around for very long.
Right.
And so we just fill up our calendars with all sorts of events and activities, but are we actually filling our calendars with enough blank space to actually enter into deeper relationships? And this is where I started my message off with, is the assumption in Scripture is that we will live in community with others. But the whole assumption here, when it says verse 25, therefore, now this whole passage is like, therefore, it's how like you relate and how you love other people around you. He's assuming that you're baked into the formula here is like this community that's going to happen, and not that you're just going to live as a Christian in isolation. And I think a lot of people live in the space of my Christianity's in isolation, but I'll live in community with others. But that has nothing to do with being a follower of Christ. I'll just have like friends from school or from work, but we never talk about like actual spiritual significant things. But he's bringing in this assumption here in the Christian life is that we actually do need people around us. And so we need that space where those relationships can develop and can flourish.
I love that. Anything else, Kirk?
No.
All right.
Good stuff.
And maybe I had one, I thought of one, but maybe I'm not understanding it. Maybe I'm not understanding my own question.
I was going to say, you wrote the question. I don't know what help you're looking for
it's
here.
possible. The one I was thinking of was sort of like an underlying bubbling of like who you can have relationships with. So like kind of this unspoken understanding that like your best relationships are going to be someone of the same age or
Right.
someone of the same gender, and don't think about going outside of that because that's either inappropriate or you're not going to find anyone who can journey through life with you in that way. Is that potentially like the stumbling block is sort of like, I don't want to say like the lie, but it is kind of taught sometimes, right? At least maybe I was not taught it, and I just made that up in my head.
Well, you picked it up from somewhere, right?
Right?
I think you're right. Like there's certain boxes we think we need to operate within. Part of this is like you kind of grew up, kind of culturally, you assume like going to school, like everyone's in the same grade, so kind of same age. So like, hey, that's where your deepest friendships need to happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then all of a sudden you're out of high school and college, and you realize that you could actually be friends with someone who's like 10 or 20 years older or younger, like whatever it is. Like you can figure out like you can actually have real, friendships beyond that for sure. Like these are cultural boxes we can find ourselves in.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and kind of what Kirk, you kind of mentioned about D groups and how you've had people say, "Oh, I'm too mature for that," and kind of challenging them by saying, "But you have something to offer other people."
Yeah.
And it's sort of the same thing of like, thinking that someone who is, older or younger than you, that you can't have a helpful, meaningful relationship.
Everybody has something to offer other people.
Yeah.
No matter what age you are, everyone has something to offer other people.
I love that. Okay, how much time do I have?
This is your last one.
Okay, my last one. Am I okay, Gabe? We also have a texted. We have a live question. This is exciting. Should we do the live? We should do the live question. Unless Kirk wants to touch on this.
No.
I'm in charge. I'm doing this.
You're in charge.
Okay.
You're the boss.
Okay. Derek's not so subtly looking at his watch. If we have If we have frustration or disappointment toward a person or a relationship and can't express it, what are we supposed to do with it? Kirk, you kind of talked about this in your message, but very briefly.
Yeah. So, I mean, the most important thing to do when you have disappointment or frustration with a person is talk to the person.
Okay.
Too often we go and we vent towards. So what I was getting at in the message where I talked about that none of these things should be part of our talk. It is meant to be like, don't go and tell everybody else about all the problems that you have with this person. Jesus and other areas of scripture are very clear. You go and work it out with them directly. And that would be the thing that I would say to people is, you bring it to God, you bring it to the other person, and you work together to figure out the solution. If you need to bring in other counselors into the situation, you do it.
There's a pattern to do that.
There are other times where you bring other people into the situation to help walk through that situation. But the motive of your heart is not, I'm going to throw this person under the bus.
Right.
The motive of your heart is help us work through this thing that we're wrestling with.
Right. Yeah, absolutely.
I would actually, I fully agree with Kirk, and Kirk mentioned this in there too. But before you even go to the other person, pause.
Yeah.
Go to the Lord and see if this is really a thing.
Yeah.
Or if it's your issue.
Yeah.
Something that's going on in your life. I talk oftentimes with, especially with couples who are looking at heading towards marriage, and we're talking, Amanda and I have sat through and talked about communication many times with new couples, and the reality that we all have filters, that things happen to us both in our past and even just in a day that cause us to receive what comes at us or receive what we hear in a certain way. And sometimes we need to stop and say, well, maybe it was a really bad day.
Yeah.
I was tired. I was cranky. Like somebody else had said something to me. It had set me off. And when I think about the totality of my relationship with this person, I probably have misread this situation. I can let it go. But if you can't let it go, and be honest with yourself, because sometimes we can't, don't let it sit there and fester in yourself. And then I guarantee you, if it festers in yourself long enough, you will start to say it to it'll start to work its way out to other people around you. The moment you know you can't let it go, you make sure you go talk directly to that person and share with them what's going on. And most of the time, and I've had this happen in my life, most of the time the person who I've been feeling this thing towards has no idea. They didn't even know. They would never have wanted to have that effect on me. And it ends right there.
I love that. That's such a practical tip too, because when you're looking at yourself, the tip is to literally spare you from it, to look at your own self first. It's not to like dismiss what you're feeling.
No.
It's to literally provide you with like an opportunity to just let it go, right?
What Jeremiah 17:9, the heart is deceitful above all things, right? Our hearts lie to us all the time. So don't just trust what your heart's telling you.
But I want to follow my heart, Derek.
I know.
Now we're going to leave, Kirk.
And I think that the aspect what you guys are talking about, why this is so countercultural, is that the assumption is that relationships should just be easy.
Yes.
It's like, well, we should just all get along. Whenever there's a road bump along the way, it's something must be seriously off. And so either we completely avoid the conversation, or we just completely avoid the relationship and just kind of jump out of it at the first sign of trouble. But the reality is like, all that we're talking about is like relationships, and loving others is actually challenging. It can take real work, and it's work that we need to really pay close attention to.
Yeah,
absolutely worth the work too. Okay, this is a bad week to forget my phone, Gabe. So we're gonna play a game of telephone, and you're gonna shout what the question is, and I'm gonna relay it into the microphone. Ready? On your mark, get set, go.
Is being an apprentice of Jesus a better term than a follower?
Okay, wait. Is being an apprentice of Jesus a better term than being a follower of Jesus? That's the whole question? Great.
Asking for a friend.
Okay.
Asking for a
I
friend.
commented on this on
This
Sunday.
is all Kirk's fault.
Yeah, this is all my fault.
Throw it at him then.
So I am not a fan of using the word follower of Jesus.
No.
Because I think in 2024 the word follower has very loose connotations in a social media age where I follow hundreds or thousands of people and I simply go, I'm casually interested in what they're doing.
Hundreds of
which is not anything near what Jesus means when he's talking about being disciples and making disciples.
Yes.
And so Derek, a week ago in Cambridge, used the word apprentice as a more modern word of helping us understand what disciple means. And I think that's a far better way of describing what a disciple is than follower.
I like that. Apprentice. That's a good one.
I'm still a fan of follower.
Yeah.
But that's
He's-
my own personal. It's just because the picture in my head
Is-
that immediately comes up in following is somebody walking in the footsteps
I get
behind
that.
the person, right?
Yeah, I get that.
But it's really important to recognize that's not necessarily the image that is going to come up for a lot of
Right.
people. In my heart, follower is a really helpful thought for me of what it means to walk in the way of Jesus.
And you see, this is why I struggle a little bit with the language of apprentice, because I know a lot of guys who work in the trade, and they work in trades, and they've been apprentice, and apprentice to them is not really a romantic term. Like that's like a
Bottom of the barrel?
I'm like bottom of the barrel. I'm the apprentice, and I got this guy telling me what to do, and he doesn't know anything. Okay, I went to school. I know what I'm doing, and it's so when I think of apprentice, I'm like, okay. But our relationship with Jesus is very different. It's a very different apprenticeship than that.
Yeah, it is.
Well, I think that's why when you look at Scripture, whether it's the church or what it means to follow, a multitude of analogies and pictures are used, because every single picture that we come up with, taken to an extent, is going to fall short of what it looks like, right? So we need to look at it from different angles.
Yeah. This is even why we have like different Bible translations.
Sure.
It's like sometimes the word can be used different ways. So
Sure.
that can be helpful to define those terms.
Yeah, and you guys are making us flip through our Bible translations this series. We've used a couple of different ones, which has been really interesting. Maybe next week we can talk about the reasons why we've been doing that. But for now, we will wrap up. I'm sad. This was fun. All three pastors. I was a little bit scared, but it was okay. And hey, this is an example of how relationship is not that hard. We're doing it right now, everybody. We can do this. They're like, yeah, no, we're done. Next week is renewing our witness. Guess where we are? Ephesians 4:17-32.
You guessed right.
Yeah. And it's our last week of this series,
Yes, it
isn't
is.
it?
Yeah.
What's the one? What is our series after this?
Well, we'll talk about that next
All
week.
right. It's a tease. He knows how to hook. It's good. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for texting in your questions. And thanks for the live question as well. Let's keep doing that and keep up the pace. Thanks. We'll see you next week.